Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Technology, Media, and Telecom at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be discussing enterprise security with our guest, the Chief Information Security Officer for Air New Zealand, Phil Ross. Phil, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for joining, especially when we start looking at so many issues around information security broadly. We talk about a lot of our data analyst perspectives, but it's great to be able to get enterprise perspectives on really some of the challenges that exist. And particularly from, I could imagine, an enterprise environment in which you operate, there are no shortage of challenges. I mean, airlines are really at the intersection of so many security concerns, whether or not that happens to be customer, operational data, operational technology infrastructure, all the stuff that's interconnected, operational resilience, multiple regulatory frameworks, to name just a few. How do you prioritize in an environment with that level of complexity?
Yeah, that's a great question, Eric. I think everyone in cybersecurity is struggling with that at the moment. For us, we're all about enabling the airline to execute on its strategy with confidence. And that sounds simple, but in reality, we're all kind of walking this tightrope. So you mentioned a few, but there are many of these industry and business drivers, as well as evolving threats and commercial realities that force us to walk this kind of tightrope. The airline industry has a long history. For example, Air New Zealand is 84 years old. And so as a result, there's a long tail of technical debt across that industry, systems that are well past the use-by date. And this poses significant challenges in terms of cyber risk and also agility, our ability to execute fast. And that's significant because we're seeing an unprecedented rate of technological change now. If you look at a graph of the number of space launches over time, we are now seeing exponential growth there. A futurist once told me, look around you, things will never be this slow again. And he's right.
We keep accelerating, and you're using the analogy of a tightrope. I think there are those in the field who also would say maybe it's being on a tightrope that's on fire. So you've got some
indeed
time constraints that you're also working against. But
yeah, so technical debt, a legacy industry that's trying to digitize as fast as it can to improve customer experience and achieve efficiencies, and coupled with that incredible pace of technological change, and an industry that's also been dragging its feet from a regulatory perspective, increasing amounts of customer data being collected and stored, and an industry that's had these boom and bust cycles and the associated impacts on technology budgets. And of course, an ever-evolving, increasingly sophisticated threat landscape made up of really motivated and capable groups, a lot of them associated with nation states like Russia and China, and impacts that can have very real implications to safety and human life. We're flying aircraft here. So that's kind of the tightrope that's on fire. And the question about how you prioritize, well, it's difficult because you can get popped any number of ways. And you can prioritize. You can sort of put a bunch of different lenses over it. You can put a risk lens over it. You can put a lens of how fast the business wants to execute on certain things and prioritize it that way. But at the end of the day, you're kind of limited by what you can realistically execute on and the business's capacity for change. And that's something we've had to get to grips with. So we've got a heavily unionized workforce. A lot of our frontline staff are unionized, and whenever we need to roll something out that impacts them, there's a lot of consultation that needs to go on. That's one example, but then other examples are, we're dealing with flying machines, and they are heavily regulated from a safety perspective. And so there's barriers to sort of rapid change there. So there's a whole lot of, hurdles and obstacles that when you sort of map that out, you get a clear view of what you can execute on quickly and what's going to take a longer time. And we end up prioritizing on that. So we take a risk-based approach, but then reality comes in and messes with our plans.
Well, it's one of the challenges of being in an environment that is risk averse. Wind up with a natural resistance to change because nobody wants to change things for fear that something breaks. And And yet you've got to cover a lot of ground when you do make up that change, which then increases risk, which, it's that back and forth of juggling those kind of capabilities. Doesn't make life simple.
Yeah, we're very fortunate that we've got a really supportive board and executive. I think that is really half the battle, because cybersecurity in a large enterprise is difficult. And without support from the top, when you start running into those obstacles, that's when you need the support. And we're lucky to have that here at the airline.
Well, it is something where we see more and more often that security has become a board level concern. Now, as long as that's a supportive board concern, hey, all the better. But that's a good place to be. Although I wonder, again, with board conversations, a lot of those discussions typically turn to investment. And as with most organizations, technical debt, legacy systems are a challenge. And a lot of this then comes down to the question of how do you move forward? And what seems to be the big debate in our sphere these days is how do you actually make that transition? Do you try and build best of breed? Do you try and federate the systems you've got? I think there are a whole set of approaches to what are being labeled platform capabilities. Where do you come down in the debate in terms of strategies and alignment in terms of how you actually do move forward?
Yeah, it's interesting, that one, because I guess the answer to much of these cyber questions is kind of it depends. But certainly for the airline, we've been around the houses on platform approaches, and certainly we've had what I guess is a long-standing kind of best-of-breed approach to tools and platforms. But I think the whole industry is struggling with that now in terms of the expense of maintaining a whole lot of best-of-breed tools, especially in the security space, but you can see it in the infrastructure space as well, more broadly. And you spend a lot of money on these disparate tools. They don't integrate very well, so you spend a lot of time integrating. And so we have a team of cybersecurity engineers, and they spend a lot of their time, instead of doing aviation cybersecurity, just integrating tools from various vendors. And it seems that cyber has actually ended up being caught up in the traditional infrastructure kind of cycle of renewing tools on a sort of 3-5 year basis. And then they're all disparate, they're all best of breed, and they're all expensive. And you spend a lot of time integrating them, and you're not actually moving the dial on cybersecurity. So we are trying to break that cycle. And one of the things that we're looking at is how can we consolidate, which vendors offer a degree of consolidation around core cyber capabilities. And so there's some vendors now that are sort of looking to do the whole cyber play across a multiple range of capabilities. And that's looking attractive, because then we don't have to spend all this effort in integrating these disparate tools. And you kind of end up, and a lot of enterprises have ended up in this visibility problem where you've got a best of breed sort of OT tool, and it looks for OT threats. And it's monitored by a third party that specializes in that OT tool. And then you've got your endpoint detection, and that's monitored by someone else, maybe your internal team, maybe you've got a third party. And all of a sudden, you've got these kind of silos of information, and that hampers your ability to detect a coordinated threat across the enterprise. And then you've got to rely on your SIEM or your SIM to kind of piece that together. And even the SIM challenge is a difficult one. You're basically taking logs from every single source you can, trying to aggregate them all together. You're essentially looking for a needle in a haystack, and that approach is kind of broken.
Yeah, it's maintaining context across all these different tools, looking to correlate, because you've got all the information, and to your point, we ought to be able to bring that together. SIM systems. I spent a lot of time living in those environments, and it's ideally, if you're able to aggregate all that information, you ought to be able to make sense of it. But of course, you got to figure out how you maintain context at ingest with lots of different formats, and it's a handful. So that can make a platform approach look more attractive, especially as we start looking at things like generative AI or tools that are going to presumably, if you can get enough of that information together, make better sense of it in an automated fashion. Many challenges on that front.
Indeed.
Well, and I guess maybe just from a basic architectural perspective, maybe take a step back and think a little bit about overarching ideas when you start looking at this. And of course, I think we discuss a lot about the usefulness of zero trust. And the good news is it's a great concept as an overarching idea. And yet, when you think about really what makes up zero trust, what are the component parts? How do you actually achieve whatever zero trust happens to be? And I guess the debates we wind up having is whether or not this is really a guiding principle that can be a North Star, or is this sufficiently vague to not particularly be useful? How do you leverage zero trust in your organization? And is it guiding principle? Is it foundational? How do you put it to work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is a great concept, but I think it's one that everyone is struggling to implement. But we're now seeing some good vendor technologies emerging, but a lot of these are sort of agent-based and relatively simple and don't address a legacy system problem, really. Identity is core, though, and that is something that we've embraced. So, it's a core concept for zero trust, and 85% of cyber attacks revolve around an identity credential, whether it's a compromised identity or an insider or a third party. So it's a great concept. It's just really how you go about implementing it, and that is actually quite challenging in a legacy environment. Certainly, we're evaluating a bunch of zero trust technologies at the moment, but it isn't going to be a magic bullet, especially in terms of some of our legacy systems that we live with.
Well, you mentioned identity, especially as we look at more attacks focusing on abusing identities and being able to leverage an identity to further access. Yeah, that's a great place to start. Think about identity. I was also wondering, we've been doing a lot of prep. Actually, we're going to be following up in a couple episodes with the RSA conference preview, of course, one of the world's significant forums in terms of what's new and what's next in information security. Are there any things that you'd like to see at RSA? Do you have a wish list of technologies or capabilities you'd like to see turn up at the conference?
Yeah, I'm hoping to make it. But in terms of, I guess last year it was very much every vendor had a sort of an AI plug. But as soon as you asked them what sort of AI they used, they didn't have an answer. So it was very much it was the marketing of AI. They knew it had to be on there somewhere, and it didn't really matter whether they were doing it or not. They just had to put it on there. But,
well, this is the challenge, right? We've been through, was it 3 or 4 years ago? Anybody worth their salt had an AI capability. Now that we have generative capabilities, there's more. And we do seem to have gotten into this situation where there's a lot of explaining to be done about, well, why is the new AI better than the old AI?
Yeah. I think there's still a lot of people saying we've got AI and it's machine learning. But I think at RSA, I'd like to see some tangible examples of how AI can augment cyber defense and incident response. And Microsoft did their security co-pilot. It looked promising, but it just isn't there yet, in my opinion. And there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, and we're still not seeing something. Well, I haven't seen anything coherent yet, but there's certainly been a lot of promise. So hopefully we'll see some of that promise being realized at RSA. It's interesting around, I guess I'd like to see how AI can augment the work that we do in cybersecurity. And as you say, context is everything. And how can we bring that context to bear on all the alerts and incidents that we're seeing?
Yeah, it's one of those things that certainly I think we've all seen a lot of work being done in the natural language processing for better query. How can I go out and query whatever my repository is of events and logs and make sense of that? And certainly for security teams, a lot of potential. But there's also, the other side of the coin. We've got attackers who are putting these capabilities together as well. Where do you come down in terms of the net benefit for AI or for generative AI? Do you think it's more helpful in the cyber realm or more hazardous?
Yeah. Well, being a cyber person, I have to acknowledge my innate skepticism. of AI. um,
Does seem that living in information security makes skeptics of most of us. So.
Yeah, and I'm not looking forward to this sort of picture that's being painted of a war of AIs, on the good side and on the bad side. So I think hopefully I'll be out sailing on my boat before that happens. But that doesn't sound very appealing. You can't deny that the business opportunities are enormous, especially in the aviation industry. There's some great use cases around predictive aircraft maintenance and things like, even anticipating turbulence. I saw there is some AI software doing turbulence prediction to make your flight smoother. That's pretty awesome. There's a lot of awesome use cases. But then, I remember the Department of Defense coming out and saying, we can't use this for missile guidance systems because the same set of inputs, we can't guarantee you're going to get the same outputs.
The old consistency problem.
Yeah.
Although I guess calling that an old problem is, I guess we're a little further down the road. But
yeah, it's an old problem, but now with AI.
Yeah, all the better.
Yeah, so, where aircraft, airlines are, certainly in New Zealand, Air New Zealand is critical infrastructure. So we're the national carrier, and Air New Zealand is difficult to get around without taking a flight. So we're essential to the country, and I think I am skeptical of, I guess, cautious skepticism with AI in critical infrastructure situations. But there's no doubt that it is attractive from the perspective of being able to help us deal with some of these cybersecurity problems that have been growing, being inundated with logs and alerts and not having the right context for things you're investigating, and just really speeding up the time to respond to an incident. And I think that's just going to be AI pulling it all together and then an experienced analyst making the decision. And I think we see AI as a good thing in that respect because it will take a lot of the drudgery out of the SecOps world. You don't want to burn through analysts having to be overworked with an avalanche of logs and investigations and their ability to respond being hampered. So I think there's a real promise here that hopefully can be delivered in terms of in the SecOps world.
Yeah.
Some of the other stuff like the spam and or the phishing. The phishing threat is quite scary. I did see a demo of something recently, and it was, again, pulling all the context in and using it for evil. So that was quite scary.
Well, as with any new technology, a lot of trade-offs we have to navigate back and forth. But I guess thinking about trade-offs and overall approaches, I'd be curious. Because we're looking forward, maybe look back a little bit. What do you think was the most underappreciated piece of security advice that you've ever been given?
Yeah, that's a good one. I guess I was given some advice around quite a long time ago when I worked in the UK government, actually. And people started talking about, cyber should be an enabler. And I knew what that meant from a theoretical perspective, but it was very hard to actually put that into practice, especially when the area of government I worked in was very much the Department of No.
The traditional standpoint of most security teams, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this is 15 sort of years ago, I guess, but it was very much the Department of No, and it was a government-sanctioned no. And I think it took a while for them to realize that actually once everyone appreciates they're not going to get the answer they want, they're going to go around you in some way. And so then they kind of put the spin on it. Well, we need to be an enabler. And I think there's been a lot of creative thinking around what cybersecurity is when it's an enabler. And sometimes you kind of think, well, there's only certain cases or looking at things through a certain kind of lens for that to be true. But a couple of years ago in the airline, we did a full kind of agile transformation. I know everyone has an allergic reaction when I say that, but It was business. It was
no, there are good parts to Agile, but
yeah. I mean, the key, and I've been part of many of those transformations, and most of them fail. But what was unique about this one was it was business driven, and we made a conscious effort within our kind of IT, our digital function, to not say, "Oh, we know how to do this and we'll run this." We just held back and let the business work through what it meant to be agile from a business perspective. And as part of that, I actually took on the customer identity aspect. So I took on internal identity for employees and third parties, but I also took on customer identity. And that has really been a game changer in terms of the conversations we're having, the way that the organization sees cybersecurity now. It feels like we are truly an enabler. So we were the first airline to enable passkeys for all of our customers. And, we were getting all the usual kind of credential stuffing and all the related things that you have with a public-facing website. But we've actually made the customer authentication journey much simpler. So no more calls to the contact center asking to, reset your password and identify the customer. They can do all that themselves, self-service. They have a much kind of smoother customer journey. And now cyber is part of all these conversations around how can we improve the customer experience. And that has been a game changer. And so that, I think, is really cyber being an enabler. So I encourage all the CISOs out there to take ownership of customer identity and get involved in those conversations, because you sort of go from being what is this big cyber cost on our balance sheet? Why is that costing so much? To actually, we're enabling a smoother customer experience.
Oh, wow. Well, you've I guess you brought us full circle, because you were talking about the importance of identity and zero trust, but getting to the CIAM, this customer identity access management piece, you brought us right back to where we started. I think that's great insight. It's also, the CIAM piece is something that I know that from our identity team, we spend a lot of time working with. But these are wonderful insights. I really appreciate it, Phil. And thank you very much for being on the podcast and offering it.
Pleasure. Thanks, Eric, for having me on.
And that is it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us. And thanks to our production team, including Carolyn Wright, Sophie Carr, and Caitlin Buckley on the marketing and events teams. And our agency partner, the 199. Please keep in mind that statements made by persons who are not S&P Global Market Intelligence employees represent their own views and are not necessarily the views of S&P Global Market Intelligence. I hope you'll join us for our next episode, where we're going to be talking about semiconductor supply chain and the evolution of really one additional stage in tech. I hope you'll join us then, because there is always something next in tech.